Charlie Chaplin huddles deeper into his threadbare coat as the February wind cuts through the narrow alleyway between Kennington Road and the Thames embankment, his worn shoes providing little protection against the frost-covered cobblestones that seem to steal what little warmth remains in his undernourished body. The gas lamps flicker weakly in the bitter night air when a raspy voice emerges from the shadows of a nearby doorway. "Lad, come here. There's room for two in this alcove, and shared warmth might keep us both from freezing before dawn." What unfolds during the next 9 hours and 16 minutes until sunrise doesn't just represent one act of human kindness between strangers. It demonstrates how genuine compassion can flourish even in the darkest circumstances, reveals that dignity and decency persist despite poverty and desperation, and teaches that the most profound life lessons often come from people society has forgotten but who still possess the capacity for extraordinary generosity. Kennington, South London, February 14, 1896, Thursday night, 11:43 p.m. The temperature has dropped to 22 degrees, the coldest night of an already brutal winter that has claimed dozens of lives among London's homeless population. Snow began falling 3 hours ago, transforming the familiar streets into an alien landscape where every doorway and alcove becomes a potential sanctuary for those without shelter. Charlie, at 6 years old, wears every piece of clothing he owns: 2 threadbare shirts, a jacket with more holes than fabric, trousers that belong to someone much larger, and shoes held together with string and hope. His mother Hannah is currently confined to Lambeth Workhouse, suffering another episode of mental illness, and his father remains absent from their lives entirely. Charlie has been living on the streets for 6 days, surviving on scraps and the occasional kindness of strangers. The man who calls out to Charlie is Thomas Hartwell, a former dock worker in his 60s whose arthritic hands can no longer perform the heavy labor that once earned his living. Thomas lost his lodging 3 weeks ago when he could no longer pay rent, joining the ranks of London's invisible population who disappear into doorways and alleys when darkness falls. "Don't be afraid, boy," Thomas calls again, noticing Charlie's hesitation. "I've got nothing to steal and nothing to gain except perhaps keeping us both alive through this night. These old bones know something about staying warm when the world turns cold." Charlie approaches cautiously, his survival instincts warring with his desperate need for shelter. The doorway Thomas occupies belongs to a closed millinery shop, its recessed entrance providing partial protection from the wind and snow that make the open street uninhabitable. "How do I know you're safe?" Charlie asks, his voice barely audible through chattering teeth. "You don't," Thomas responds honestly. "But lad, we're both facing the same enemy tonight, the cold that could kill us both before morning. I'm offering to share what little warmth these old bones can provide. That's all I have to give." Charlie studies Thomas's weathered face, illuminated sporadically by the distant gas lamp. The man's eyes reflect fatigue and hardship, but also something Charlie recognizes as fundamental decency. After years of navigating London streets, Charlie has developed an instinct for distinguishing between people who might help and those who might harm. "Why would you help me?" Charlie asks, still maintaining cautious distance. "Because, lad, we're all we've got. When the world forgets about people like us, we have to remember each other. Besides, a small body like yours might fit into this alcove better than these old bones, but together we might generate enough warmth to survive." Thomas's explanation contains no sentimentality or false promises, just practical recognition that mutual assistance serves both their interests. This honesty reassures Charlie more than elaborate assurances would have. Charlie settles into the doorway beside Thomas, immediately feeling the difference between the open street and the partial shelter of the recessed entrance. Thomas removes his own coat, a garment nearly as threadbare as Charlie's but slightly larger, and spreads it across both of them. "Now then," Thomas says matter-of-factly, "we'll need to sit close together to share body heat. Nothing improper about it, just survival. My grandmother used to say that warmth shared is warmth doubled." As they arrange themselves to maximize the benefit of their combined body heat, Charlie discovers that Thomas possesses a small treasure, a piece of bread, stale but edible, wrapped in newspaper. Without hesitation, Thomas tears the bread in half and offers the larger portion to Charlie. "I found this earlier behind a baker's shop," Thomas explains. "Day-old bread, but food nonetheless. Growing boys need nourishment more than old men." Charlie accepts the bread gratefully but notices that Thomas has kept the smaller piece for himself. "Are you sure you don't need more? You're bigger than me. Size doesn't always determine need, lad. My stomach has learned to expect less. Yours is still growing and requires more fuel to keep your body working properly." This exchange reveals something important about Thomas's character. His generosity emerges not from abundance but from careful consideration of relative need. He understands hunger intimately but chooses to prioritize Charlie's welfare over his own comfort. As the night progresses and the wind intensifies, Thomas begins sharing stories to distract them both from the cold. He talks about his years working the London docks, the ships that arrived from distant countries, the goods that passed through his hands on their way to wealthy households throughout the city. "I used to load tea from India, silk from China, spices from places I couldn't pronounce," Thomas tells Charlie. Every crate and barrel represented someone else's wealth, someone else's comfort. But touching those goods, knowing they came from so far away, made me understand that the world is much larger than these streets where we find ourselves tonight. Charlie listens intently, fascinated by Thomas's descriptions of exotic goods and distant places. The stories transport him temporarily from their immediate circumstances, providing mental escape from the physical discomfort of cold and hunger. "Have you ever wanted to travel to those places?" Charlie asks. "Every day, lad. But wanting and being able are different things. The men who owned those goods could afford to travel wherever they wished. Men like me just imagined what those places might be like while we loaded and unloaded their treasures." Thomas's response contains no bitterness or self-pity, just honest recognition of social limitations. But his imagination and curiosity about the wider world reveal an active mind that poverty has not diminished. Around 2 a.m., the snow intensifies and the temperature drops further. Both Charlie and Thomas begin showing signs of serious cold exposure, shivering that comes in waves, difficulty speaking clearly, and the dangerous drowsiness that can precede hypothermia. "Lad," Thomas says urgently, "we need to stay awake. Sleeping in this cold could be permanent. We'll take turns telling stories, asking questions, anything to keep our minds active." "What should I talk about?" Charlie asks, struggling to formulate coherent thoughts. "Tell me about your dreams," Thomas suggests. "Not your sleeping dreams, but your hopes for what you might become someday. Dreams cost nothing and can warm the spirit even when the body suffers." Charlie begins describing his fascination with the performers he has occasionally seen in London's music halls, the comedians, dancers, and singers who can transform audiences from sadness to joy through their artistry. "I want to make people laugh," Charlie tells Thomas. "I want to perform on stages where people forget their troubles while watching me. I think laughter might be one of the few things that rich and poor people can share equally." "That's a fine dream, lad. Laughter is indeed something that costs nothing to give and everything to receive. Tell me more about how you would make people laugh." Charlie, energized by discussing his aspirations, begins demonstrating some of the physical comedy gestures he has observed and practiced. Even in their cramped doorway, he manages to perform exaggerated walks, facial expressions, and mime routines that make Thomas chuckle despite their desperate circumstances. "You have a natural gift," Thomas observes. "Comedy requires understanding how people think and feel, and you demonstrate that understanding already. With practice and opportunity, you could indeed bring laughter to many people." Thomas's encouragement means more to Charlie than praise from someone who knew him in better circumstances would have. Here is a man facing his own desperate situation who still takes time to recognize and nurture Charlie's dreams. As dawn approaches, Thomas makes a decision that will stay with Charlie for the rest of his life. From somewhere within his layers of clothing, Thomas produces a small silver coin, a half-crown, representing more money than either of them has seen in weeks. "Lad," Thomas says solemnly, "I want you to have this. It's not much, but it might buy you a meal and perhaps a night's lodging in a proper shelter. Charlie stares at the coin in amazement. But what about you? You need food and shelter too. I've survived many cold nights, and I'll likely survive many more. But you're young, and you have dreams that deserve the chance to grow. Consider this an investment in the laughter you'll someday bring to others. I can't take your money, Charlie protests. We should share it like we shared the warmth and the bread. Thomas smiles, the first genuine smile Charlie has seen from him all night. Lad, this is my choice to make. In my 63 years, I've learned that sometimes the greatest pleasure comes not from what you can buy for yourself, but from what you can give to someone who needs it more. Charlie accepts the coin with trembling hands, understanding that he is receiving far more than money. He is experiencing an act of pure generosity that expects nothing in return. Why? Charlie asks simply. Because kindness is one of the few things in this world that increases when you give it away. Because in a world that often ignores suffering, every act of compassion matters. And because tonight, we kept each other alive, and that creates a bond that should be honored. As sunrise begins to illuminate the frost-covered streets, Thomas prepares to leave their shared shelter. Charlie realizes that he may never see this man again, that their paths may never cross despite the profound impact of their shared night. Will I see you again? Charlie asks. Perhaps, lad, perhaps not. London is large, and people like us move where circumstances force us. But remember this. Kindness received creates an obligation to show kindness to others when you have the opportunity. The warmth we shared tonight should be passed on to someone else who needs it. Thomas stands stiffly, his arthritis clearly worsened by the night's cold, and gathers his threadbare coat around his shoulders. One more thing, lad, Thomas says as he prepares to leave. When you become the performer you dream of being, and I believe you will, remember that your greatest audiences will be people like us, people who need laughter to forget their troubles for a while. Never lose sight of what it feels like to be cold, hungry, and forgotten. That understanding will make your comedy true and meaningful. With those words, Thomas Hartwell disappears into the early morning shadows of London, leaving Charlie alone with his silver coin, his dreams, and a lesson about human kindness that will influence every relationship he forms for the rest of his life. Charlie uses Thomas's half-crown to buy a hot meal and a night's lodging in a decent boarding house. But the true value of that gift extends far beyond its monetary worth. It demonstrates that generosity can flourish even in desperate circumstances, that dignity persists despite poverty, and that human connection can transcend social boundaries. Years later, when Charlie achieves the success Thomas predicted, he makes a practice of carrying silver coins to give to people who need immediate help. This habit puzzles some of his wealthy friends, who consider such charity inefficient or potentially fraudulent. Why do you give money to strangers on the street? They ask. Because once, when I was desperate and forgotten, a stranger shared his warmth, his food, and his hope with me. That kindness saved my life and taught me that we are all responsible for each other's welfare. Throughout his career, Charlie creates comedy that speaks especially to audiences who understand hardship, loneliness, and the daily struggle for dignity. His little tramp character embodies the qualities Thomas displayed that February night: generosity despite poverty, dignity despite circumstances, and the capacity for hope despite overwhelming challenges. In 1952, during an interview about his childhood, Charlie tells the story of Thomas Hartwell for the first time publicly. That man taught me the most important lesson of my life, Charlie explains. He showed me that kindness is not about what you can afford to give. It's about recognizing the humanity you share with others and acting on that recognition regardless of your own circumstances. What was the most significant aspect of that encounter? Thomas could have ignored me, or worse, seen me as competition for limited resources. Instead, he recognized that our survival might depend on cooperation rather than competition. He understood that sharing what little we had would benefit us both. Did you ever try to find him again? I searched for years, hoping to repay his kindness and let him know how his generosity influenced my life. I never found him, but I learned to honor his memory by treating others as he treated me, with respect, compassion, and the understanding that we are all more alike than different. The 9 hours and 16 minutes Charlie spent sharing warmth with Thomas Hartwell proved that human kindness can survive even the harshest circumstances, that dignity is not determined by social status or material wealth, and that the most profound lessons about decency and compassion often come from people society has overlooked but who possess extraordinary capacity for generosity toward fellow human beings struggling with similar challenges.